They said I joke too much, that I don't fit the mold. But last time I checked, I'm the one still bold.
Welcome to the Heart and Hustle podcast. I'm your host, Omar Hargrove, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about control in handling conflicts. And I think that the response doesn't look unhealthy. When we're talking about avoidance and explosion, these two conflict responses are easier to sometimes recognize because they almost feel obvious. Like, it feels obvious when we're avoiding something. It feels obvious when we explode. But they leave these visible marks. Today, I want to talk about response that often feels like it should be rewarded. And it's one that looks composed, responsible, maybe even, dare I say, mature. And it's the idea of control. Control in conflict doesn't raise its voice, it doesn't shut down, it doesn't storm out of the room. In fact, it often sounds calm and articulate, and often moves conversation forward quickly. And because of that, it can be mistaken for emotional health. But control and health are not the same thing. And if we're not careful, control becomes a socially acceptable way that we avoid vulnerability within our conflicts. So let's talk about why control feels like the right thing sometimes. And I'll be the first one to say that this could be this at a time was like my what I thought I was doing was mature, but really I was trying to control conflicts. I was trying to control scenarios. And when tension enters a room and something inside of us wants stability restored as quickly as possible, conflict disrupts that predictability. And we don't like uncertainty. So that once that emotional movement doesn't feel tidy, many people, especially leaders, if you're a leader, you're most likely like a type A personality. That instability feels uncomfortable, so control steps in to stabilize everything. Control says, let's clarify this right now. Let's correct what's wrong. It says, let's get this resolved so that we can move forward. And on the surface, it feels productive. It keeps the conversation contained, and it reduces escalation, and it gives this appearance of strong. But what's often underneath that urgency is not necessarily clarity, it's discomfort with uncertainty. And control isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about fear, and fear that the conversation will spiral, or emotions will get messy, that even authority could be questioned, or that the relationship will shift in ways that you can't manage. Instead of sitting in the tension long enough to understand it, control tries to organize and compartmentalize it. And the subtle difference between leading and managing, I think that control hides in plain sight that through leadership language. If you're wired as a leader, your instinct during conflict may be to guide the conversation. You define the problem, move toward resolution, and that's not inherently wrong. I mean, it's not like these things are the worst ways to handle conflict. It's good to have clarity. It's good to have direction. But the subtle shift is where leading through conflict means creating space for understanding before resolution. Managing conflict through control means prioritizing resolution before understanding. And these two things are not the same thing. Again, what leading is creating space for understanding, while managing is prioritizing, let's just fix this. And the reason that this difference matters, because when someone brings up a concern to you and you immediately explain, correct, or reframe it, you may feel like you're being helpful, like, okay, there, I fixed it for them. But you actually might, while you might feel like you're providing clarity, the other person probably doesn't feel fully heard. The resolution won't feel stable to them. It may feel efficient, but it won't feel relational. And that kind of conflict, it feels whenever we do that, where we're efficient but not relational, or where we try to just get the resolution without understanding, that conflict will most likely resurface later. And that's why it's important to understand that control has seemingly right elements to handling conflict, but control rarely announces itself as dominance. It often feels like responsibility. And I think that especially when we stay calm, we speak clearly, we keep conversations structured, it makes us feel like, well, I'm doing all the right things. But if someone feels redirected too quickly, or they may just shut down, or they may stop fully sharing what they have to their side. And if they feel corrected before they feel understood, they may just withdraw internally, even if they nod externally. And what we end up doing is that we're not necessarily handling conflict. It gives the mirage that we're handling conflict, but what we're really creating is compliance. And just because we have compliance doesn't mean that we've built trust. And again, I'll be the first one to say that I recognize the same tendency in myself to where so many moments to where I could better articulate myself than the person that I was having a conflict with, and I could, unintentionally corner them to where they couldn't explain themselves, and I just sound more right. And even though they're like, well, I guess you're right, I didn't see it like that, and I would be able to just like, okay, like I won. This internal, I won. Now we can just move on. But there's that, it would always resurface, or the trust felt fractured from that. And it's like these moments where a team member can say that makes sense while still feeling unheard. Even our spouse, say not just teams, but just our marriages, our relationships. There's so many times where in the past where I was able to, prove that I was right to my spouse, and they're like, okay, well, I'm sorry. But they still didn't feel good about it. Yeah, I didn't handle the conflict. I just got them to comply with my side. And it goes even to friendships where, all that we're describing is people feeling like they have to agree because you control the narrative, but they still feel dismissed. And control doesn't always silence people by force. Sometimes it's silencing them by efficiency, by being able to articulate yourself. Just because you're a better talker, you're able to better control that narrative. And it's not that you're trying to manipulate, you're not trying to force things, but for us to recognize that if we're moving too quickly towards fixing it, we're not really leaving room for processing. And control can feel mature, or I would say it feels more mature than it is. One of the reasons this pattern is difficult to confront is because it doesn't always look volatile. When we think of controlling, we think of just kind of like an egotistical, narcissistic person. We think that they're yelling or shutting people off, storming off. I think those are more along the lines of that explosion. But with control, most people who are controlling are able to be steady, composed, articulate, and compared to avoidance or explosion, it feels like growth. I've really come a far way. I'm not running away from my problems. I'm not exploding them. But what we're trying to understand is that composure is not the same as openness. And it doesn't mean that we're handling conflict in the healthiest way. You can remain emotionally regulated and still avoid vulnerability. You can be calm and still be closed off to what other people have to say. True maturity in conflict isn't about suppressing our emotions. It's about staying engaged emotionally without losing grounding. Control sometimes keeps you grounded, but it can also leave you disengaged. So if we were to try to break down control, what it typically resists the most is vulnerability. We're trying to just use our heads. We're just using logic, and we're almost like closing ourselves to the emotional processing. And again, you could argue that there's times and places for that, but to say like, oh, emotions aren't allowed in the workplace, well, that's silly. that's outright silly. We're just as much as we're physical beings, we're emotional beings and mental beings too. All of this makes up the person. Okay, vulnerability says, help me understand what you're experiencing. It says there may be something here that I'm not seeing. It says, let me sit with this tension long enough to really hear each other. Control wants the discomfort to pass quickly and move on with business as norm. Vulnerability allows one to sit and be willing to be wrong, be willing to not get the full picture yet. And sitting with that discomfort feels risky at first. It means that you don't get to immediately close the deal. It means that conversation might not resolve as cleanly as you want to force it to. It also means that you have to trust the relationship enough to breathe in tension. But it's with all that, what we're saying is it actually requires strength. It's a different kind of strength. It requires a confidence to believe that the relationship can survive honesty without being managed into submission. Again, just because you can convince people you're right doesn't mean that you're right. And it also doesn't mean that it's going to make this conflict resolve just because, well, we said I was right, so we can move on. I think that for many people, control in conflict is learned just like avoidance or explosion. Maybe you grew up in an environment where chaos felt dangerous and you learned to steady the room. You learned how to make things calm. And I think that there's elements that you want to keep the peace. You learn to manage conversations before they escalated. You learn that if you stayed composed and directive, things didn't spiral. And maybe those are some of the biggest motivators of why you try to take control. Is you're trying, the heart, you could say, is good, is that you're wanting to avoid an explosion. You're wanting to avoid the chaos. But while that strategy has probably helped you at different points, what once kept things stable can eventually still prevent things from becoming secure. And control creates order, but I would say like intimacy. That to have that emotional buy-in, it requires openness, and openness cannot be forced into neat timelines. And again, I'll share. I feel like I've shared this recently, but when I used to be in sales, I was able to control conversations really well. With any objection that was raised up, I was able to talk people out of objections. And I could convince them that by buying this thing or by saying yes to this deal, that it was the best decision for them. And I could corner them and do that. But when I controlled that narrative to where I overcame every objection articulately, most of the time, when their emotions were still there and settled late at night, where they're uncomfortable to sleep as they're thinking about it over and over, feeling like they weren't heard, feeling like they didn't get to actually share their side, and wishing that they would have said something a different way, but I was just too quick for them. They would typically end up canceling. They would cancel before the deal would go through, and I would have all these chargebacks because, again, I could talk up the good sales game. I could control the narrative. I can control the conflict. But because I didn't allow their emotional, them to be heard, it would always fall back on me. And that's what I'm trying to get us to understand when it comes to this looking like it's right. You're able to see that initial solution, what feels like that initial win, but it doesn't have longevity. It's a mirage. It's not real. And handling conflict well doesn't mean abandoning the structure that we have when it comes to elements of control. It doesn't mean that we have to become passive, and it certainly doesn't mean that we have to let conversations wander without direction. All I'm saying is that we need to be willing to slow down long enough to ensure understanding happens before resolution. It means asking, how do you feel about what I'm saying? Do you feel like what are your thoughts on what I'm sharing? Do you feel like you agree with it? Are there parts of you that feel unsettled? Instead of assuming that, oh, this is all resolved, it's all closed now. It means being comfortable with a little bit of emotional movement in the room without rushing to shut it down. And for us to understand that health is, when it comes to healthy conflict, it's not that health is not the absence of discomfort. Health is the ability to stay present within that discomfort during conflict. So if you see yourself in this pattern, this isn't just about it's not us labeling that control as toxic. Okay, we're simply learning how to recognize where it may be limiting the connections and even the longevity to the conflicts that we think we're handling. Control feels strong, vulnerability feels too exposed. But it's this kind of vulnerability that builds trust in ways that control never can. Again, we want longevity. So with all that being said, I hope that this episode made a difference for you. It's all from my new book, Handling Conflict. Say what needs to be said without burning it all down. But until next time, have a great life.
Then tell me why you still watch every move I take. You call me phony, nah, I'm just free. And if you still doubt me, go by my book.